Hey guys, behold, I got my 32X. I just picked it up like 5 minutes ago. So here it is in all its glory. This is the Sega 32X. It was an add-on for the Sega Genesis or Sega Mega Drive, if you like to call it that. This is a 32-bit add-on that lets you play 32-bit 32X games for the Sega Genesis. Also, some Sega CD games required the 32X CD games. They're a little bit more rare, but there are games that require both. Basically, there's two 32-bit processors in here, extra video system, sound system. There's an upgraded sound system in here. So it added a lot of power to the Sega Genesis near the end of its life. This system came out in 1994 in North America. Actually came out in North America before it came out in Japan. I think this thing was actually produced by Sega of America, which is a little strange because, you know, the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD are all products of Japan. But anyways, you insert this on top of the Sega Genesis like so. This is the Genesis 2, and I don't know if I can carry this all at once. Here's my Sega Genesis 1 with Sega CD, and yes, it does fit on there. And it actually looks pretty sweet if you ask me, jokingly. But as far as hookups went, this thing required its own power supply. And then not only did it require its own power supply, but there's a video cable here. Comes with this little adapter cable here, which runs out of the video out of your Genesis, and then runs into here. And then normally where you plug your TV thing out of the back of the Genesis, you plug into here. So the video is coming out of the Genesis into here, and then out of here to your TV. It's not coming out of the Genesis to the TV directly anymore. This also let you play Genesis games, of course. It acts as a bypass. Although oddly enough, Virtua Racer doesn't work on the 32X because the Sega SVP chip that's in the Virtua Racing cartridge interferes with the memory addressing that the 32X processors use. So that's kind of interesting fact there. So all Genesis games will work on here except Virtua Racing. A lot of people joke about this system. Technically, I think it's pretty sweet. I mean, two 32-bit processors. I mean, it added a lot of power to the Genesis, albeit too little too late, I guess you would say. You know, sure, it's adding a lot of power to the Genesis, but we're talking about a system from 1989. I mean, it was already pretty much on its way out by the end of 1994. PlayStation was just around the corner, you know. But this was also $159 US at launch, so really expensive. I mean, by the time you bought a Sega Genesis and a Sega CD and a 32X, you got like $400 worth of crap. And there weren't a lot of games released for the 32X either. I think something along the line of maybe 20-30 games released for the 32X. So, you know, it was considered a failure. People like to joke that it looks like a mushroom. Well, I could say it looks like a mushroom cloud. And if this Genesis represents Sega, then, you know, they pretty much just nuked themselves with this thing. But anyways, I only have two games for it, Mortal Kombat 2 and Virtua Fighter. I really wish I had Doom for it, but I don't, so I'll show you Virtua Fighter since it's the only 3D game I have, and here we go. So the games themselves came in these cardboard boxes as opposed to the plastic cases like the Sega Genesis games did. And the cartridges themselves are very similar to a Sega Genesis cartridge. Given that the Sega Genesis cartridge has to fit into the 32X slot, that makes sense. So here's Virtua Fighter. I'll stick it in this beast, and we'll fire her up. So you gotta wait for some loading, or shouldn't say loading, but some boot up screens here. and pretty soon you'll be seeing some very primitive early 3D graphics. Now there's no actual 3D video processing chip in the 32X. All video renderings done by software by the two 32-bit processors. There's also a much higher color palette on the 32X compared to the Sega Genesis. Whereas the Sega Genesis, I believe, could display something like 64 colors on screen at a time, out of a possible 256 or something like that. The 32X could display 3,000 colors on screen, somewhere around 3,000, give or take. A much higher color palette of colors on screen at a time. So that was the other benefit. You had much better sound processing. You had two 32-bit processors, and you had whatever the hell I was just talking about. The colors, more colors on screen. And then of course with the Sega CD you'd have the storage. Thing with the sound is that not a lot of programmers knew how to take advantage of the extra sound processors in the 32X. There was extra sound hardware in the 32X, but it was very hard to program for, and apparently Sega didn't give very good documentation on how to do so. There was no good development kits for the sound, and therefore very few 32X games took advantage of it. Doom on the 32X is a good example, because Doom on 32X has horrible music, and the music in the Super Nintendo version is amazing. And technically speaking, the 32X could actually output sound on par to, if not better than, what the Super Nintendo could have done. So it was just the programmers not taking advantage of the extra sound hardware in the 32X whatsoever. And I think that was the case with most 32X games. I don't think really anyone took advantage of the extra sound hardware. But, I mean, here's the graphics. They're 3D, and you know, I actually have to say I like this system. I do. You know, I want to get Doom for it. I want to get Star Wars for it, and you know, I can definitely see the potential in the system. I mean, you know, late 1994. You know, it was late, but you know what? Genesis and Super Nintendo, as far as I remember, were still doing pretty good in late 1994. They were still doing pretty good in 1995. So I mean, I don't know, the potential was there for adding this kind of power to the Genesis, but just didn't take off, and I guess not a lot of good games, too expensive. Maybe the games were too expensive, I'm not too sure about that, but the system was $159 for an add-on like the 32X, you know. That was pretty steep back then. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it's never saw the light of day, but anyways, I'm happy to get my 32X, and it works great, so I'll see you later.